Good morning. Welcome to the Night Conference Center at the museum, situated between the White House and Congress. Today is historic. In the next few hours, as we examine Missouri's constitutional ban on public funds for religion, the U.S. Senate is expected to confirm in a simple majority vote the next U.S. Supreme Court justice. This reminds me of the challenge and the opportunity to provide nonpartisan leadership in highly partisan times. I'm Nate Walker, and I'm honored to serve as the Executive Director of the Religious Freedom Center. We are a nonpartisan national initiative focused on educating the public about the history, meaning, and significance of religious freedom, and we promote dialogue and understanding among people of all religions and none. This is all possible because of the life's work of our founding director of the center, Charles Haynes. He has spent over 2 decades helping groups find common ground on seemingly intractable church-state issues. He has created a culture here at the museum where people who usually litigate one another come to engage in civil dialogue, thus ensuring that everyone leaves alive. Our purpose is simply to help leaders forge a shared understanding of the place of religion in public life and to work together to sustain America's bold experiment in living with our deepest differences. We are grateful to everyone who has made this event possible, including Stanley and Carrie and Savannah from Alliance Defending Freedom, Dan from ACLU, Amy from SCOTUS blog, Kimberly from Bloomberg, and Rich from USA Today, as well as my museum colleagues Stephanie, Ashley, Megan, Cedric, Jacques, and everyone from Wolfgang Puck. We're grateful to all of you for making this possible. Public programming is one of the means by which we seek to promote legal literacy here at the museum. In this brief video, you will learn about our new initiative to train religious and civic leaders to become constitutional and human rights specialists on issues of religion and public life. 7 institutions of higher education currently offer graduate credit for those who complete our courses, and thanks to our generous donors, such as the Arthur Vining Davis Foundations, we're able to provide scholarships for these classes. In the last year, our students, 61% of whom are people of color, have come from 15 different states and have expressed 9 nationalities and 23 different religious identities. Let's hear from some of those students.
Religious freedom is the right that we all have to believe and also the right to exercise our belief.
If you take a look at several of the countries around the world now, what people are going through just because people profess a religion or a faith which is different from us makes them subject to violence.
I'm particularly committed to the cause of religious liberty because of being confronted with hatred and misunderstanding and the actual human toll that can take. I want to understand as a country how we built our concept of religious liberty, how we protect it, where we have fallen down, and how we can hopefully prevent those same problems from reoccurring in the future.
It's important to teach about religious freedom because we need to get rid of religious illiteracy if we are going to become a better citizen.
The Religious Freedom Center of the Museum Institute is a place that convenes people from all sides of the spectrum. We really try to help people think how to use the principles of the First Amendment in their public life.
Our courses are designed to help religious and civic leaders equip themselves in the history of religious freedom in the United States, to engage in the contemporary issues of our time, as well as understand how the media is reporting on religion and how religious leaders and religious groups can engage in the media, as well as the human right to freedom of religion or belief. Meaning it's the international, domestic, contemporary, and historical issues that are designed to equip religious and civic leaders on becoming constitutional and human rights specialists.
This is a fantastic program. It's an opportunity to dialogue with people of different faith systems that I would have no reason to sit down and talk to. being able to come transparent and saying, I don't know, why do you believe that? Why would you think that? Has been absolutely fabulous.
Every day that I participate in this course, I learn something new that I wasn't expecting to learn. And this is such an incredible opportunity to dive into issues that are difficult to talk about in public education.
It's great because we get to start out by meeting each other online. We meet on videos, we see each other. They will do anything and everything to help you to succeed. They will make sure that they take care of you so that you're comfortable in your learning environment, whether it's online or whether it be immersion.
These are people who are willing to come together around this larger purpose of, I am not free unless you are free. And that's the reality. That's what we're working for. I'm only as free as you are.
If you want to make a difference in this country, if you want to understand how you can make a difference in this country, if you want to understand what your rights are and what your role is, these classes are right there for you. It's foundational so that you can go as far as you want with the information that you gather here, and you become a more informed and educated citizen.
Education about religious freedom is essential for the future of our country, and it's essential for the future of the world. If we're going to shape public policies that serve the common good, we're going to have to learn about the civic ground rules provided by religious freedom, because those ground rules in the First Amendment are what enable us to negotiate our differences, to understand one another, and to work for common good across those differences.
You too can become a constitutional and human rights specialist focusing on religious freedoms. Check out religiousfreedomcenter.org to learn more and to apply for graduate level courses in the First Amendment.
Good morning. My name is Carrie Kupek, and I am the Communications Director and Legal Counsel for Alliance Defending Freedom. Alliance Defending Freedom is the largest legal organization in the world that advocates for the rights of all people to freely live out their faith. Before I begin, I'd like to thank Nate Walker, the Executive Director of this wonderful Religious Freedom Center of the Museum Institute. Nate, it's been such a pleasure partnering with you, and I'm so grateful for you and Ashley and your event staff who've just made this such a great process. And I just also would like to say what a great resource we have here, right in the heart of Washington, D.C. This wonderful center, which, as Nate said, we can come together, engage in civil discourse, and talk about some of the most important issues of our time. As I mentioned, I work for ADF, and along with the other cases that we work on, we have an extensive Supreme Court practice, which is, in large part, why we are here today. Trinity Lutheran Church of Columbia v. Comer, this is the playground case. It's coming up very soon for oral arguments at the Supreme Court on April 19th. The facts are pretty simple, and they're undisputed. Trinity Lutheran Church has a preschool, and this preschool applied to a state tire scrap program that provides reimbursement grants to purchase rubberized surface material, these tire scraps, for children's playgrounds. 44 applications were submitted to the state, and from various nonprofits. 14 were accepted, and Trinity Lutherans ranked number 5 of those 14 that were accepted. However, the preschool was ultimately denied the grant for its playground solely because the playground belongs to a religious organization. At its core, the Trinity Lutheran playground case strikes at the heart of American jurisprudence, asking, what is fair play in a pluralistic society? Personally, I think this concept of fair play is what makes this concept most interesting. This is not a new question. Thinkers and philosophers long before us have been asking this question, starting with Aristotle, and before Aristotle, and Augustine and Abravanel, and struggling with this idea, church and state, and how does this work? What is tolerance in a society that is religiously diverse, that is pluralistic, where people from all walks of life are coming together, doing what they do best? If civil liberties travel together, how should we be protecting religious freedom and making sure that all people of faith are able to thrive? Lucky for us, we get to continue that conversation and debate today, and I think it's important that we do that. This concept of civil discourse, unfortunately, is something that's becoming increasingly lost in this society, and that's sad, especially in a country like America. This is a great melting pot of a nation of many faiths, races, walks of life, and that's what makes us uniquely American. Religious freedom is our shared legacy. It's our common bond. It's our roots. This is what makes us distinctly American. And I think Governor Bobby Jindal said it best when he said, "We didn't create religious freedom. Religious freedom created us." And since we're all thinking about what's happening in a couple of hours from now, I'd also like to mention that if Judge Neil Gorsuch is confirmed as our 9th Supreme Court Justice, this case, this Trinity Lutheran Playground case, will be the first religious liberty case he hears on the bench. So just remember that you got a preview of it here first. Before I introduce our wonderful participants in today's event, just one housekeeping item. You'll notice that you have cards on your chairs, blank cards, and on those cards you can write questions for the Q&A portion at the end. And then about 15 to 20 minutes before the event ends, we'll have people collecting those, and then we will be asking the panelists your questions. The other thing I would encourage you to do, and it'll be up here at some point, is engage in the Twitter conversation using hashtag Trinity Lutheran and using the hashtag of the Religious Freedom Center. Arguing for Trinity Lutheran's preschool today is Eric Stanley. Eric Stanley serves with Alliance Defending Freedom as Senior Counsel and Director of the Center for Christian Ministries. He oversees all litigation efforts related to the First Amendment freedoms of the church and houses of worship and to ensure those freedoms are protected as such. Stanley received his Master of Divinity degree from Liberty Baptist Theological Seminary and his JD degree from Temple University School of Law, where he graduated cum laude in the top 5% of his class. Very nice, Eric. He is the member of the bar in Florida, Kansas, Arizona, the District of Columbia, the U.S. Supreme Court, and numerous federal district and appellate courts. Arguing for the state of Missouri is Daniel Mack, sitting right here up front, and he is the director of the American Civil Liberty Union's program on freedom of religion and belief. He leads religious liberty litigation, advocacy, and public education efforts nationwide, and he often writes, teaches, and speaks publicly on religious freedom issues. Mr. Mack currently serves as an adjunct professor of law at the George Washington University Law School, focusing on constitutional law and religious liberty. Prior to his work at the ACLU, Mr. Mack was a partner in the Washington, D.C. office of Jenner and Block, where he specialized in First Amendment law. Our Supreme Court justices, our moderators for today. Here we have Amy Howe. Amy is an independent contractor and reporter, the previous editor for SCOTUS blog. And I think anyone who follows the Supreme Court knows we all are constantly refreshing SCOTUS blog on days of decisions and orders and hashtag waiting for Lyle. And as most of you know, SCOTUS blog is devoted to the coverage of the U.S. Supreme Court. Amy previously served as counsel in over 24 merit cases at the Supreme Court and argued 2 cases there. She co-taught Supreme Court litigation at Stanford Law School and at Harvard Law School. She has also served as an adjunct professor at American University's Washington College of Law and Vanderbilt Law School. Amy is a graduate of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, go Tar Heels, and holds a master's degree in Arab Studies and a law degree from Georgetown University. Kimberly Robinson, at the far end, has been on the leading edge of Bloomberg BNA's Supreme coverage since joining the company from private practice. She has covered high-profile oral arguments and decisions, including Obergefell v. Hodges, Fisher v. University of Texas at Austin, and litigation involving the Affordable Care Act. Prior to joining Bloomberg BNA, Kimberly was an attorney at the global law firm Morrison & Foster, LLP, where she was a member of the firm's litigation group. Kimberly has a JD from Columbia University and a BS in finance from Arizona State University. I'd also like to mention that Kimberly was one of the first Supreme Court reporters I ever met when I moved here to Washington, D.C., and I've always appreciated how gracious and kind she was to me when I met with her that day out in Arlington. Rich Wolf has been a USA Today reporter and editor for 3 decades. He has been the Supreme Court correspondent since 2012 and covered the White House during the Bush and Obama administrations and spent a decade reporting on Congress as well, and served for 5 years as the newspaper's congressional editor. Before joining USA Today, he was a Washington correspondent for Gannett News Service and a reporter and editor at Gannett Newspapers in New York. Would you join me in welcoming our participants? We'll be beginning with 5 minutes of opening statements from both Eric Stanley and Daniel Mack, and Amy Howe is our Supreme Court Chief Justice for today.
We'll hear oral argument today in Trinity Lutheran Church of Columbia versus Comer. Mr. Stanley.
Madam Chief Justice, and may it please the court, the state of Missouri established its scrap tire grant program as a means of reducing tires in Missouri's landfills and reusing them for beneficial purposes, in this case, protecting children's safety on the playgrounds. The state established the groups who were entitled to apply for grants. It said all nonprofit groups could apply. It also established over 16 different criteria by which it would judge every application that is submitted to it for a scrap tire grant. None of the criteria have anything to do with religion. They look at things like how much recycled tire material comes from Missouri, the commitment of the applicant to the program, and the surrounding poverty level. Trinity Lutheran Church owns a preschool and daycare and submitted an application establishing how it met those 16 different neutral criteria established by the state to receive a reimbursement grant. The state scored the applicants that were submitted to it that year according to its neutral criteria, and it ranked Trinity 5th out of 44 applicants. The state awarded 14 grants, but Trinity didn't get a grant. It got a letter from the state that said, we cannot give you a grant because it would violate the state's constitutional provision against providing aid to a church. In the name of upholding its state anti-establishment principle, the state of Missouri engages in status discrimination that violates the Free Exercise Clause and the Equal Protection Clause of the United States Constitution. The state excludes Trinity Lutheran solely because of its religious status, that it is a church. And it does so even though Trinity furthers the purposes of the program better than the applicant that received the grant that Trinity should have received. This court has never allowed such status discrimination. In Employment Division versus Smith, this court said that the Free Exercise Clause prohibits government from, quote, imposing special disabilities on the status of religion. But that is exactly what Missouri triumphantly proclaims in its brief that it does. It says in its brief that, quote, it is undisputed that the policy at issue is not facially neutral. Churches are, by virtue of their religious character, ineligible for playground resurfacing grant funding. This case is like McDaniel versus Patey, where McDaniel was excluded from being a constitutional delegate solely because of his status as a minister. A majority of the court in that case found that Tennessee's law that said that ministers were not eligible to be constitutional delegates violated the Free Exercise Clause because it operated against McDaniel because of his status as a minister. The court said McDaniel cannot exercise both rights simultaneously because the state has conditioned the exercise of one on the surrender of the other. That is the choice Missouri puts to Trinity Lutheran. If Trinity shed its religious status, it could participate fully in the scrap tire program. It would have to surrender its right to operate a religious preschool for obtaining the benefit. As Justice O'Connor stated in the Kyrios Joel case, the religion clauses all speak with one voice on this point. Absent the most unusual circumstances, one's religion ought not to affect one's legal rights or duties or benefits. This is not one of those unusual circumstances. Rather, this is a neutral government program intended to protect children from being hurt on the playground. The children that play on the playground at Trinity Lutheran are just as deserving of protection as any other children. As we said in our brief, a rubber playground surface accomplishes the state's purposes, whether it cushions the fall of the pious or the profane. But Missouri, in essence, says that in order to enforce the separation of church and state in its state constitution, it must treat religious people worse than everyone else. It closes the door entirely to Trinity Lutheran solely because of its religious status, even though it met the goals of the program the state itself set up. The state cannot enforce a higher degree of separation of church and state by violating the Free Exercise Clause through blatant status discrimination. This court already addressed this issue in the Widmar case, dealing with the exclusion of a religious group from an open forum. Missouri, in that case, tried to justify its exclusion of the religious group by pointing to the same constitutional provision it raises in this case, Article 1, Section 7 of its state constitution. This court rejected that justification, stating, the state interest asserted here in achieving a greater separation of church and state than is already ensured under the Establishment Clause of the federal Constitution is limited by the Free Exercise Clause, and in that case, the Free Speech Clause as well. This court should likewise find that Missouri's asserted interest violates the Free Exercise Clause. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Mack?
Good morning. May it please the court. The church here argues that the court should override the state of Missouri's longstanding anti-establishment interests and force state taxpayers to give direct cash grants to houses of worship. This is a novel, sweeping position that, as the court below said, is frankly unprecedented. The Missouri constitutional provision at issue here is in line with provisions in 3/4 of the states across this country, reflecting a tradition of not supporting churches with direct taxpayer funds, a tradition that dates back to the adoption of the Bill of Rights and the founding of the nation. It's important to step back and look at first principles here. The founders recognized that preventing government funding of churches would promote, not threaten, religious liberty, and this is for a number of reasons. Funding was widely understood at the time to be a form of religious coercion, government funding, religious coercion of unwilling taxpayers. It threatens church autonomy and independence. It imposes government involvement in their operations, makes churches dependent on government largesse, and provides incentives for churches to distort doctrine in order to curry favor with whoever's handing out the money. In fact, despite what the Eighth Circuit said in dicta, the state here actually was not only allowed to deny the funding here, but required to deny the funding. This court, the Supreme Court, has consistently warned against the dangers of direct cash grants from taxpayers to houses of worship, saying it falls precariously close to the original object of the Establishment Clause. Now, what's also important to remember here, how churches and religious organizations are treated under the law generally, not just in this case. In our constitutional scheme, religion generally and churches specifically get special treatment. This reflects not hostility, but an effort to protect the rights of conscience and the independence of faith communities. The First Amendment singles out religion in two distinct ways in the Constitution, the Free Exercise Clause and the Establishment Clause. Sometimes this gives heightened protections for houses of worship, requirements for the government to remain hands-off, extra benefits that churches enjoy. Other times there are special restrictions on what the government can do vis-a-vis religion. It can't endorse, the government can't favor, can't promote, and it can't directly fund. But the church wants to have its cake here and eat it too. They want to keep the special benefits that they enjoy, as well as forcing the state to hand over direct cash grants. So the church, as I said, wants to undo this enduring, long-standing rule. That is a rule that prohibits the funding. But even if that weren't the case, the state does not need to establish that the Constitution, the federal Constitution, forbids this funding. All the state needs to show is that it was within its authority, its constitutional authority, to make this choice. And over a decade ago, this court in Locke versus Davey made absolutely clear in a 7-2 opinion written by Chief Justice Rehnquist that states do have the authority, if they so choose, not to fund religion. Even where funding is permitted, as in that case, as in Locke versus Davey, the state can make the legitimate decision not to fund certain religious groups or activities. This court has emphasized numerous times that there's room for play in the joints between what the Establishment Clause forbids on the one hand and what the Free Exercise Clause requires on the other hand. And this case falls squarely within that play in the joints. And in fact, this case is stronger than Locke and an easier case for the state to make. Now, the church, just to wrap up, and I'm sure we're going to talk about many more of these points, the church has absolutely every right to spread the gospel to the surrounding community, to build its facility, to make capital improvements to its property. But it does not have the right to insist that taxpayers foot the bill for it. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. We'll now have questions from the bench, and you'll each have an opportunity to respond. I'd like to start with you, Mr. Stanley, and ask you to address the point that Mr. Mock just did. Why isn't this, our decision in this case, governed by Locke versus Davey?
Yeah, well, for several reasons. Locke, and the most important one is that Locke versus Davey was not a status discrimination case. So the question in Locke was not about who Joshua Davey was, but it was about what he was using the scholarship for. So in that case, it would be a different case, and maybe this is the best way to explain it. It'd be a different case if Washington, in that scholarship program, had said that all students were eligible for the promised scholarship in Locke unless you're Jewish. That's this case, and that's status discrimination. So Locke was more concerned about the use of the scholarship for the devotional training of theology. And the court in Locke also said that that program went a long way toward including religion and its benefits. You could be a religious student, you could study religious classes, you could even take theology courses. You just could not do it for the devotional training of clergy, which was a unique historical interest that this court held fell in the joints between the free exercise clause and the establishment clause. So the basic answer to the question is this is not a status discrimination case, or Locke was not, whereas this one is. This case is actually more like McDaniel versus Patey, where McDaniel was excluded, as I said, from being in the constitutional delegation solely because of his status as a minister. Just like Trinity Lutheran is excluded here from the reimbursement grant solely because of its status as a church.
Mr. Mack, and if you could address his point, please, about McDaniel.
Yeah, this case is completely different than McDaniel, and it's important to note that almost every case they rely on was distinguished in Locke. McDaniel was about participation in the political process. This case is about getting a handout from the government. And here's why this case is even easier than Locke. And if they can't distinguish Locke, they are out of luck here, because Locke rejected every one of the arguments that they've made. Locke involved a scholarship program that was essentially an indirect grant program. So the scholarships went to the students, then the students could decide what school they wanted to go to. So that's number one. Here we have a direct cash grant program, and the cases treat those two situations dramatically differently. Number two, the aid in Locke was available to everyone who met the criteria. Every student who was in the top 15% of their class, who had the right SAT scores, and who met the economic need requirements, every single one of them got it. It was generally available. Here we have a discretionary grant program with limited funds, and fewer than 1/3 of the applicants who applied for this grant got it. So it's not the case that as long as you meet it, you get it. Most of the grants, the applicants did not receive the grants in the tire program in Missouri. And third, and related to one of the earlier points, there the money was going to religiously affiliated institutions. Here it is a direct cash grant to a house of worship, which the Supreme Court has never allowed, let alone decided that states must do.
Mr. Stanley, can I ask you, is your friend correct that if we assume that there is a valid anti-establishment clause concern on the part of the state, that you lose this case?
No, that's not correct, and for a couple of reasons. The first is that practically there is no valid establishment clause concern. In fact, the state itself concedes that this does not violate the establishment clause in order to give this money or to allow Trinity Lutheran to participate in the reimbursement grant. So there's no argument, and the Eighth Circuit even acknowledged that below, that this seems rather logical that Trinity Lutheran under this court's precedent could participate in this grant fully under the Establishment Clause. So it doesn't violate the Establishment Clause for Trinity to be a part of this reimbursement grant program. And this is different than the unique historical concern that this court held in Locke fell within the play in the joints. In that case, the court said it was the devotional training of clergy. It was paying for someone to be trained as a pastor or a minister. And you know, this case deals with direct aid to churches, which this court has allowed under the Establishment Clause. There's just not the same type of unique historical concern that was in Locke. In fact, this court's precedent is littered with cases where direct aid has gone to religious institutions controlled by churches, and in some cases without even any safeguards as to the use of the aid. And so in that respect, it's not a unique historical concern in the same degree as Locke. And again, Locke is different because that case did not deal with, the court never countenanced in Locke that Joshua Davey could be excluded from the program because of who he was. That was not at issue in Locke. What was at issue was what he was using the money for. What's at issue here is who Trinity Lutheran Church is. The state, remember, shut the door at the very beginning of the process of Trinity Lutheran. It closed the door totally and said, you can't participate in this reimbursement grant program at all for no other reason, simply because of who you are. This is more like a merit-based program. And in fact it is, because Trinity Lutheran scored really high. They merited a grant in this case. But yet they were shut out of that solely because of their religious status. And that's what distinguishes this from Locke and from the play in the joints. The court's never held that status discrimination falls in that play in the joints.
So on the question of whether there's an establishment clause concern, you don't have to agree with me that the establishment clause actually forbids this funding, although, again, if you look at the cases, there are no cases that allow it. Direct cash grants to houses of worship. But you don't have to agree with that. All you need to do is recognize that there is an establishment clause concern. Now, let's remember in Locke, the court said not only, the court pointed out that it would have been permissible if the state had chosen to allow the scholarships in that case to go to students who wanted to pursue devotional theology degrees. Because it was an indirect funding scheme, the court had already decided that that would have been permissible. Nonetheless, the court still said that the state may pursue these anti-establishment interests, even if the federal establishment clause would have allowed it. And it is those same anti-establishment interests that are at play here. The court in Locke looked back at a bunch of the state constitutions and said, states have always cared about this sort of thing. And the sort of thing that they were talking about is not limited, as my colleague would like it to be, to situations in which ministers were funded. It was provisions that prevented direct taxpayer-funded churches. And if you look at what this court said as far back as Everson, that the imposition of taxes to pay minister salaries and, this is important, and to build and maintain churches and church property aroused the indignation of the founders. And it was these feelings which found expression in the First Amendment. So it's not that the founders only cared about funding ministers. Surely they did, but they also cared about funding churches and church property, and that's exactly what we have in this case.
Mr. Stanley, let me ask you this. A lot of the attention that this case has garnered is because it deals with swings and slides and children's playgrounds. But I don't hear you making the argument that, nor am I suggesting you should, that that's all you're looking for, that if you won on the basis of, well, it's only a playground and not a homeless program or not something that bears more on religion, that would be considered a victory. I assume you're looking for much more than a kind of a simple cabined decision that says, well, because it's simply a playground, clearly a non-religious entity, that would be sufficient?
Well, let me say first that if the court wants to go in that direction, we certainly would accept that win. However, I do think that the principle applies more broadly than just a playground, although I do think the fact that it's a playground informs the analysis here. There is nothing religious about a playground. We're talking about a rubber surface on a playground that is intended to protect the health and safety and well-being of children. This is about as far away from religion as you can get. The playground surface itself does nothing to advance religion. It doesn't make religion any easier. There's been some concern on the other side about, well, perhaps there'll be religious worship on the playground or something like that. Well, the rubber playground surface doesn't facilitate that any more than if it wasn't there in the first place. And so this, again, is purely secular aid that goes to, yes, a religious institution. But our point is that the religious institution, and here, Trinity Lutheran, should not be shut out solely because it's religious, especially when there's no establishment clause concern. Mr. Mack keeps saying that there is no doubt that this type of aid would be violated, or would violate the establishment clause. The exact opposite is true. This court's precedent, as I said, is littered with direct aid to religious institutions. In Hunt, direct aid to a Baptist college owned by a South Carolina Baptist convention. Tilton, direct aid construction grants to universities operated by churches. Allen and Regan are the same. So this court has always been concerned, again, not with the status of the organization, of who they are, but with the use of the aid. What is it going for? Is it going for a religious endeavor? In this case, it's not. And I would submit in this case, it's just like what the court said in Romer. Religious institutions need not be quarantined from public benefits that are generally available to all. It's like saying that churches are, by virtue of their status, prohibited from any aid. It is just another way of saying that, well, that's status discrimination, which this court has never allowed in any case. And McDaniel versus Patey is a good example of that. And again, there's no limiting principle to that logic at all. If you follow that logically down, churches could be denied police and fire protection, which is a concern that this court has addressed and has raised in previous cases. So we think this is different. The playground informs the analysis because it is secular, and we think that leads to Trinity winning in this case.
Mr. Mack, let me just ask you a related question, and that is, what if we were not? What if the state was not directly writing a check to the church, but was writing a check to an affiliate such as a hospital or a school that was clearly affiliated with the church, but it was going to, say, a playground association or something like that? If there was some subset here of the church, would that make a difference?
That would impose fewer Establishment Clause problems, but that would certainly not affect the state's ability to make the constitutional choice that it has made. And as to the playground issue, so first of all, again, not one of those situations that you heard involved direct cash grants to a house of worship, and the court has never allowed it. That's number one. But two, even assuming the court is concerned with what goes on the playground, the school, and this is all in the church's words, the school is a ministry of the church. There are no guarantees about what occurs on the playground. However well-meaning a program, you have to think about what's going to happen down the road. And this court has cared about that exact thing, what happens down the road. In this case, the church refused to certify that it wouldn't use the playground for religious activities or purposes. And it has said that religion is infused in everything the school does, that the Learning Center, the school, is a ministry of the church that incorporates daily religion into its daycare program. It teaches a Christian worldview not only to children of members of the church, but to non-member residents. And it says that it uses the school to bring the gospel message to non-members. Now, so down the road, the church could use its playground improved at the government's expense for religious purposes in connection with the preschool, with its Bible school, with its Sunday school, or any other youth-oriented church event that involves religious instruction. And it's not the material itself. Obviously, there's nothing inherently religious about tire material, but there's nothing inherently religious about a piece of wood, but that piece of wood could be used to build a chapel. But the court need not get that far. I mean, the reason that we have this rule and that we allow states to make this constitutional choice is that we want to help avoid situations in which there is the monitoring of the sorts of things I was just listing. The state doesn't want to get in the business, and the church shouldn't want it to get in the business of monitoring what goes on its property.
And so just to follow up on Justice Wolf's question, you've referred to the direct cash grants, but your answer would be the same if instead of writing Trinity Lutheran a check, a bunch of state workers showed up one day with a bunch of rubber and actually did the playground itself.
Well, the question in the case is, can the state decide that it's not going to do that? And the answer to that question is yes, absolutely.
You've referred a couple of times to the long-standing state constitutional provision on which Missouri is relying, and some of the friend of the court briefs in particular on the other side talk about them as Blaine amendments and say that they were enacted during a wave of anti-Catholic bigotry. Is that true, and does that matter to our analysis?
It's not true, and it doesn't matter.
Okay. Can you elaborate?
The church has waived this argument. That's the most important point to make here. The church did not make this argument below in the Court of Appeals or produce any factual evidence for the assertions that its amici are now making and that it alludes to in its briefing now. And there's good reason for that, because there is none. This is a weak argument that was already rejected by this court in Locke, and there's no reason to think that should undermine the provision here. Regardless, the church hasn't made the argument, so it has been waived. But this is something that has been tried and failed numerous times. The Missouri Constitution, from its first constitution in 1820, has included prohibitions on taxpayer funding of churches long before this Blaine debate. And I think the best place to look for the historical story here is a historian's brief that was filed in support of the state, which lays this all out. Again, this is an issue that's not even before this court. That's how weak the argument is.
Mr. Stanley.
So I would say it is true, but it might matter or might not. That's how I would answer the question. It is true that Missouri does have a Blaine Amendment, that this amendment, and there are several of the amici briefs in support of petitioner that address this, the Cato Institute and others, that address the fact that this is in fact a Blaine Amendment. It was adopted around the same time as the federal Blaine Amendment was rejected, 1875. And so there's evidence that it is. We made the argument, we didn't waive it. We made the argument, and specifically in our briefing, in a way of distinguishing Locke versus Davey, because Locke did say in that case, well, the Washington State Constitution was not a Blaine Amendment, suggesting that maybe the analysis would be different if it was. And this court has said, and has raised concerns, as Justice mentioned, about Blaine Amendments and the anti-Catholic bigotry history that is a part of that. And so we think that it is, and we think that because it is, it does matter what the history of that is. However, even if the court says it's not a Blaine Amendment, we still win, because what this really boils down to, again, is status discrimination. You know, I keep hearing that this is direct cash grant to the church, but this is actually more like in-kind aid than anything else. I mean, this is a reimbursement grant. Trinity Lutheran Church is actually out money because of participating in the program. It has to put over $10,000 of its own funds into the program in order to receive the reimbursement grant. And it's not just like a direct cash payment to the church that the church can use for anything that it deems necessary. There are strict controls and procedures to ensure that it's only used as a reimbursement for the playground resurfacing. What I think that Mr. Mack is getting at is the idea that this court has rejected, that any money that goes to a religious organization is somehow suspect and should be reduced or prohibited under the Establishment Clause because it frees up money somewhere else for the church to use for a religious purpose. In Hunt and Regan, this court said that the court has not accepted the recurrent argument that all aid to religious organizations is forbidden because aid to one aspect of the institution frees it to spend its resources on other ends. The court in Romer talked again about the police and fire issue and said, if this were impermissible, giving money to a religious organization which frees up other money for it to be used for religious uses, the court said a church could not be protected by the police and fire departments or have its public sidewalks kept in repair. And then the Romer court went on to say, this court has never said that religious activities must be discriminated against in this way. And I think that gets to the nub of the problem in this case. Again, the playground is secular. There's no serious argument that the playground itself can be used for religious purposes. The aid in this case is going to a purely secular reason. And that's all that this court has ever been concerned about in its precedent, is what is the aid being used for? Missouri, though, wasn't concerned about what the aid is being used for. Missouri was concerned about who gets the aid, a church. And regardless of the fact that the church had a merit-based program and it qualified for the grant better than 39 other applicants, it shut the door solely because it's a church. That's something this court has never held is permissible under the Free Exercise Clause.
I just have a follow-up on the Blaine Amendment question. You suggested that we should consider the history of these amendments, but should we be looking at the history when the original Constitution was adopted or when it was reaffirmed in the mid-20th century?
Yeah, I think you can look at the history when it was originally adopted, and I think that the history itself informs how it's being applied today. And so, you know, it was readopted in the mid-20th century, I think 1940s, but it was not changed at all. It was just simply reaffirmed and readopted. But the history when it was adopted was one of, you know, in fact, the court has said sectarian in the Blaine Amendment in Missouri was code word for Catholic at the time, and it was a wave of bigotry against Catholic schools. And so the history, the intent behind the Blaine Amendment was to shut out Catholic schools from being involved or from getting any funding for their schools. Missouri's doing the exact same thing here, the status discrimination. And so you can trace that back, and Missouri's doing the exact same thing that it was doing back in 1875.
Do you want to address that?
Again, I don't think, I think this is a half-hearted effort to throw this issue into the case at the 11th hour. So I don't think it needs to be taken all that seriously. But it's important to note, again, that There were anti-funding provisions going back to the 1820s in Missouri. As Your Honor just pointed out, this provision was readopted in the 40s, and never, not once, has this provision ever operated to discriminate among faiths. This is the whole argument about how it's supposedly anti-Catholic. There's no evidence whatsoever, not only that it was intended to operate that way, there's also no evidence that it has ever operated in a non-neutral fashion.
Mr. Stanley, you talked earlier about the slippery slope that would apply if you were denied the funding and that it could extend, say, to police and fire. What about the obvious slippery slope in the other direction, that if we rule that because this is a playground program, it should be allowed? Where's the limiting principle in not having the state get involved in programs of the church that are obviously religious?
Well, there's two answers to that. The first, I think, is a factual response. The second is a legal one. Factually, in this case, the limiting principle is what Missouri has actually done in this case. So if you look at what they said in terms of who could get the grant, they have what's called a notice to religious-based institutions, and there are three things that the notice says. The first is if you're a church or if you're owned or controlled by a church, you can't get it. The second, though, and the third talk about you can't use it for religious activities and for religious use. And so factually, Missouri's already put that in place, and that safeguard in place, that the grant reimbursement cannot be used for religious activities. And factually speaking, I also think that the fact that it's a rubber playground surface means that it cannot be used for religious activities. This court has actually said that when the aid lacks content, there's less danger that it can be used for religious uses. And this rubber doesn't have any content at all. It's just rubber on the playground surface. But legally speaking, I think the limit is also what this court has said, which I identified before. The court has been very concerned about what the aid is used for. And this court has been very watchful over any aid that goes to further religious uses or religious activities, religious worship. And so that is a well-settled legal precedent of this court under the Establishment Clause. And I think that goes to kind of where is the line in this case. So the line here obviously cannot be that Missouri cannot or the line cannot be that the Establishment Clause is violated by giving the aid. Obviously, that's the backstop to all of this. But on the other side of it, it also cannot be that Missouri can erect so high a wall that it violates the Free Exercise Clause rights of the people of Missouri, which is what it's done here by engaging in the status discrimination that I talked about previously.
If you want to address that, but Mr. Mack, I wanted to ask you another question. What would be the harm of, I want to phrase this the right way, if we rule only that playground type program, a program that is clearly non-religious, is worthy of funding, what would be the harm of limiting it to that and not going any further? What would you, it's a form of the same question. Do you see it as inevitable that it becomes a slippery slope? Or isn't there a way that we could limit it?
That would be a narrower ruling. But again, the phrasing there is important, because I don't think the court would rule that funding a playground is a worthy endeavor, because that is exactly what this court is not supposed to be doing. That is a decision that is left up to the state. And this is undoubtedly a worthy program writ large. It does good things. But the ruling in your hypothetical would have to be that the state has violated the federal constitution by relying on its own constitution. And even if that ruling were cabined somehow to playgrounds, it would be a big problem, because it would tell the state of Missouri and 3/4 of the states across the land that you cannot make these decisions for yourself, that you cannot act on your long-standing anti-establishment principles that date back to the founding of the country.
Can I just respond to one thing that Mr. Mack just said? He said that this court cannot rule that funding a playground is a worthy endeavor, that that's a decision that is left to the state. Well, Missouri made that decision. It made that decision that Trinity Lutheran was worthy of this grant. In fact, it was more worthy than 39 others. But yet it shut the door solely because it was religious. So Missouri's made that determination that this is a worthy endeavor, and the only reason it shut the door is because of its religious status.
I actually have a couple questions related to the process. First, I know you've both discussed the idea that the cash is going to the church, but that they will fill out forms. Is that something that's required of all recipients of the funds and not just the churches? And then my second question is, are there scenarios in which other institutions apply for the funds, are ranked highly, but for reasons that don't have anything to do with religion, don't get the funds?
So I think I'll answer the first question. Yes, every applicant has to abide by the same procedures. And so every applicant has to fill out the requirements. In fact, the Code of State Regulations requires a financial assistance agreement to be filled out and signed by the entity before you actually get the reimbursement grant. And then there are safeguards in place that you have to keep your receipts, you have to have an accounting of what you use the money for, and you can only get the reimbursement grant after the surface is already installed. And so that's for any applicant, any entity that's.
So the church isn't, so the state isn't necessarily getting more enmeshed in the church's business than it is in the independent preschool down the street that also gets the grant.
That's exactly right. And I think that underscores how neutral the criteria are. As I said at the beginning, these 16 different criteria have nothing to do with religion at all. In fact, anybody could apply under these neutral criteria. The state has a blind scoring system where it ranks and it scores you according to those neutral criteria. Trinity Lutheran, I think, scored like 640 points under the state's point system. It even has a blind tiebreaker that if two tie, that there's a blind draw as to who gets the money. And so really there's no danger of the idea that a church would get the money or that a church would get the money ahead of somebody else who is more deserving. Missouri's already taken care of that in its neutral criteria.
Mr. Mack?
Yeah, I mean, I don't dispute any of the process, although it's important to note that on the questionnaire, there's a question: do you certify that none of these funds will go to support religious activity? Now, the church wasn't able to certify anything because another one of the certifications is essentially, are you a church? But I can't imagine they would be willing to certify to that, and that does involve some involvement of the state after the fact, or at least holding the grant recipients to their word.
I think the church would be willing to certify that it is that none of the funds would go toward a religious activity or religious use. In fact, it could easily certify that because it's a playground surface that's not religious at all. I think what the church was not willing to certify to was the fact that it's not a church. In fact, it crossed through that line and it provided a letter in support of its application that said, we actually are a church. The department said, thank you for your candor in describing who you are. Now, because we know who you are, you don't get the grant.
So the church, which says religion infuses every part of its school, the school is a mission of the church, would certify that it's not going to hold outdoor Bible study on the playground on a nice day.
I mean, you can't say that every single activity of a religious institution is somehow religious. There are secular things that a religious institution does. I mean, having a playground and building a playground is a secular activity of a religious institution. It's about as far away as it can get. It is for playing for children. They don't hold religious worship services out there. So, yeah, it'd be easy to certify that that's the case. And that underscores the problem here, that this is funding that goes, it's a reimbursement grant that goes for a purely secular activity. And I think that informs the analysis here. The state has no valid Establishment Clause concern here. This is not like Locke at all, where this was the unique kind of historical concern that the court addressed of the devotional training of clergy. There's been no unique historical concern for not funding secular activities of religious organizations. In fact, the court said the opposite, that religious organizations should not be quarantined from public welfare benefits applied to everybody. This is a public welfare benefit, and they should be entitled to get it just the same as everybody else.
So if I can just respond briefly to that, I want to return to the importance of having bright line rules. And the state of Missouri has this bright line rule because it doesn't want to get involved in the business of looking into exactly this sort of thing. It wants to leave the church to its autonomous behavior. And this court, in the Nyquist case, some very similar facts. It involved direct cash grants for a clearly worthy cause, which was the maintenance and repair of facilities and equipment to ensure, this is important, to ensure the health, welfare, and safety of students in failing schools, in low-income schools. The court did not question the importance and the value of preserving a healthy and safe educational environment for its school children, and yet it still struck down the grant. And this was a grant that some of the money was going to go to heating and lighting costs, and the court was concerned about that too. And that was an Establishment Clause case, so that was not a situation in which the state made the decision not to fund. There, the government made the decision to fund. The court stepped in and said, no, worthy cause or no, this is something that we don't want to get involved in, direct cash grants. And so here we have an easier case, because this isn't a situation where the court needs to worry about that at all, because the state has chosen a different approach. And the only question here is whether the state was allowed to make that approach. But the court, if the state had made the first approach, the court has struck down that very decision in other cases.
And just briefly, if I could just follow up on what you said about Nyquist, the court actually distinguished in Nyquist the programs that were involved in Everson, Allen, and Tilton, and Allen and Tilton were direct aid to religious institutions as more narrowly channeling aid, quote, to the secular without providing direct aid to the sectarian, which is exactly what I just said. There is the ability for the court to allow funding under the Establishment Clause for the secular portions of a sectarian institution. And that's what this is. It's a playground service.
In one of those cases, there was a rule that for 20 years, no religious activity could take place in a facility that was funded by the government. The court said, that's not good enough, because what happens in the 21st year?
All right, we have time for one more question with short answers.
Well, I have a question about Locke. I'm not sure I agree that that isn't the controlling case here, but I have a couple of questions about the reliance interests that have been placed on Locke, and also if we're inclined to agree with Justice Scalia's dissent there that funds tend to set the baseline, what's the standard that we'd apply in future cases?
The standard, I think, would be, and it's actually an easy standard in this case. So the standard would be that the state cannot engage in religious status discrimination in support of its anti-establishment interests. That's exactly what this case is about. And so I think the court, Mr. Mack talks about bright line rules. This court has had a bright line rule, not against not funding religious institutions, but against religious status discrimination. This court has never allowed religious status discrimination. And so I think that's a very bright line rule that this court could say, Locke doesn't apply because that was not about status discrimination. This case is, that's a bright line rule for the future.
Mr. Mack, you're going to get the last word here.
Yeah, the status here, that word's being thrown around a lot. The status here is not who you are as a person. This is the fact that you are a core religious institution that we in our constitutional scheme have decided to insulate from all manner of government regulation. And so for that same reason, the court made very clear in Locke that those sorts of decisions can be made with respect to funding, and it is not the same thing. The court rejected all of these arguments we're hearing today.
All right. We have, do we have time for one more question, or go ahead to opening statements? Okay, one more question?
Let me ask this is a lightning round question for Mr. Mack. You mentioned as one element of a longer answer earlier that it mattered that these were competitive grants. There wasn't enough money to go around. You would be denying a non-religious nonprofit by giving money to the church. What if there was more money than you knew what to do with? I don't think you were trying to make the point that if money was overflowing, that the church would line up last but could get something at that point. Would that make a difference?
No, it is a far easier case because it is a competitive limited grant. But even with an unlimited grant, I think the state could have made the decision it made constitutionally.
I would just say that all aid that the government has is selective to some extent. So the government makes financial choices. This court held that way in Rosenberger, that scarcity of economic resources is not justification for discrimination. And that's exactly what happened here. So scarcity or not, I think the discrimination is unconstitutional under the Free Exercise Clause.
Terrific. Thank you. All right. You now each have 5 minutes for your closing arguments.
Well, thank you for being here today and for participating. Almost 3 years ago, Justices Kagan, Sotomayor, Ginsburg, and Breyer captured the principle at stake in this case, I think. Speaking in dissent, albeit in a different context, they said this: For centuries now, people have come to this country from every corner of the world to share in the blessings of religious freedom. Our Constitution promises that they may worship in their own way, without fear of penalty or danger, and that in itself is a momentous offering. Yet our Constitution makes a commitment still more remarkable, that however those individuals worship, they will count as full and equal American citizens. A Christian, a Jew, a Muslim, and so forth, each stands in the same relationship with her country, with her state and local communities, and with every level and body of government, so that when each person performs the duties or seeks the benefits of citizenship, she does so not as an adherent to one or another religion, but simply as an American. Trinity Lutheran Church seeks the benefits that the state of Missouri made available to all nonprofits who applied and met its neutral criteria. Trinity was entitled to come to the state, not as a church, but simply as a nonprofit preschool whose children were just as deserving of a safer playground as any other. Instead, Missouri shut the door to Trinity, not because it failed to meet the neutral criteria, and not for any other neutral reason, but simply because it was a church. What makes the status discrimination more remarkable is that Trinity Lutheran was one of the most deserving that year. It met the requirements and fulfilled the purposes of the reimbursement grant better than 39 other applicants. Yet despite this fact, Missouri believed it had to treat Trinity worse than everyone else simply because it was religious. What also makes the status discrimination remarkable is what I mentioned in the argument, is that we're talking about a rubber surface for a playground. That's about as far away from religion as you can get. That's why this court has described status discrimination as odious. It classifies people according to their religion and then denies them benefits solely because of that status. Missouri cannot erect so high a wall separating the church and state that it walls off the free exercise clause's protections for its own citizens. It has attempted to do so here, and this court should hold that it has violated the free exercise clause. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Mack.
So it's important to remember, again, the principles that underlay the state's decision. These are principles that date back to the founding and that are reflected in the overwhelming majority of state constitutions across the country. And that is this, that taxpayers shouldn't be compelled to support houses of worship. This goes back to Madison, and the Supreme Court has made it clear over and over again. But again, the issue in this case is not whether it would have been unconstitutional if the state had instead chosen. I believe it would have been unconstitutional if the state had chosen to fund this church with direct cash grants. But here we have something else. The state exercised its authority pursuant to a provision that it has had in its Constitution for over 150 years to separate out that situation, the funding of churches, keeping in mind all of the concerns that animated the adoption of the First Amendment and the adoption of provisions like this throughout the country in state constitutions. It made that choice, and as this court made clear in Locke versus Davey, it had the constitutional authority to make that choice. I would just say this to the church, and for those who are on its side and rooting for the church in this case, be careful what you wish for. They're asking now for an equality rule. They want it to be treated equally, and they want to ignore these long-standing anti-establishment principles. But if there is strict equal treatment across the board, let's think about all of the benefits that houses of worship get under our legal system. They get special benefits, exemptions, accommodations from anti-discrimination laws, from the state itself has a Religious Freedom Restoration Act. Exemptions from child care regulations, all manner of special benefits to houses of worship. And that is because there is a long-standing tradition of the government keeping its hands off. Be careful what you wish for. If you want equal treatment across the board, you may see some of those benefits under fire as well. And I think those, many of those benefits are important and vital to religious liberty in this country. And that is why groups like the Baptist Joint Committee, which filed a brief in this case in support of the state, made very clear that disestablishment protects religious liberty. It ensures that churches are not funded through coercive taxation and the power of the state, but through the voluntary offering of adherence. You get your extra benefits, you get your extra exemptions, but sometimes you have to pay your own way.
Thank you, Counsel. We have questions.
Questions from the audience. So Mr. Mack, this is for you. Would it be permissible for a state to deny student aid or accreditation to religious schools?
Student aid.
For a state to deny student aid or accreditation to religious schools?
Well, the Supreme Court has already made clear that it's permissible for vouchers under the federal Constitution. States can make decisions that they are only going to fund public education. So, in that sense, yes.
So, well, I guess my response would be that no, it would not be permissible for the state to deny aid. In the court's, I think, decision in Zellman is a good example that Mr. Mack just mentioned, where the court drew the distinction between direct aid and indirect aid, where there's a true private independent choice that people would make in order to funnel aid that would eventually end up in a religious institution. And so, no, that would not. And I think if the state were to do it in the way of upholding its own state anti-establishment interests, like Missouri did here, by just shutting the door simply because you're religious, well, that goes back to what I said about distinguishing Locke before, that Locke versus Davey would have been a different case, I think. It probably would have been a 9-0 decision in favor of Joshua Davey if Missouri, or if Washington would have said in that case, well, you cannot be involved in the Promise Scholarship Program even though you are worthy of it, simply because you're Jewish or Christian or Muslim or Hindu, whatever that would be. So that's status discrimination, and I think if the state were to do that, that would be unconstitutional.
Okay, next question. This is for either Eric or Dan. If the court concludes that this program or any benefit is generally available, would you agree that houses of worship cannot be excluded even if it involves the expenditure of taxpayer dollars? In other words, does this case turn on whether this particular program is generally available?
I think that's essentially the same question that Justice Wolf asked, and I think that is an important factor here, but it's not dispositive, and the state could still make that decision even if this were a benefit that were generally available.
Yeah, I think I agree in the fact that it's not dispositive. I think we've heard some argument about the fact that this is not generally available, this is somewhat of a selective program, but I think it's even a little bit worse in this case because of how the program is structured. This is more like a merit-based program, and Trinity Lutheran kind of had the merit under the neutral criteria to be involved in the program and to get the reimbursement grant, and yet the state shut the door solely because it was religious. So I think in that respect, this case is different. It doesn't turn on whether the aid is generally available to all. I think that though the state, and this is kind of the interesting thing about this case, the state was the one, as I said in the opening, who set up the class, who was involved. They set up who could be involved in this program, and they said all nonprofits. So it's kind of interesting to hear the state kind of come in now and say, well, this is selective, and so you can't be a part of it, when the state itself set up the class as to who would be involved in this program. So I think it's helpful. Certainly if you're talking about generally available public benefits, like it would be available to everyone, such as police and fire protection and things like that, then I think absolutely not. I don't think the court would ever countenance denying that aid. And it's interesting, Missouri said in its brief that, well, we could have the power to do that under the state constitution, but we would never do that, which I think underscores kind of how far an extreme its position is in this case.
That segues into the next question, which is the, quote, special benefits churches enjoy are enjoyed by all nonprofits who freely participate in the grant program. Why exclude a church that meets grant requirements? And I think this has pretty much been answered, but if there's anything else you'd like to add to that.
Yeah, the only other thing I would say is that it does kind of highlight the fact that if you look at the way the scrap tire grant program works, is that this is funded not through a general tax revenue from the state, but this is actually funded through the fee that you pay when you turn in your old tires of your car. So if you were to go and kind of say, I need new tires, and then you turn in the old tires, Missouri charges you a recycling fee for those tires. All of those fees go into a pot of money that the state then gives out as grants. And so, that I think is kind of an interesting twist to this in the sense that nonprofit organizations pay into the program by having the fee and by paying that fee when they replace their own tires, but yet they can't participate in the program that they pay into.
No, again, the benefits that houses of worship enjoy generally in the state are vast. The benefit to this program is getting the cash grant, but I think it's, again, important to keep in mind that this is a scheme that should be viewed in the larger context of the overall regulatory framework and constitutional framework of the state, in which houses of worship and religion generally get all sorts of special treatment.
So we have a fun question for our final question, and this is for anybody who's participating. So we have our panel and our petitioner and respondent. What do you think Justice Scalia would have said about this case?
I would love to hear it, honestly, because
that's up for anyone.
I think that his dissent in Locke would have come roaring back in his traditional fashion, hopefully in a majority opinion here, but no.
I think it would be interesting to add a question to that, which is, what would Justice Gorsuch think?
That's right. We'll find out.
We'll find out.
And whether one of you might be more happy that he will be sitting in on this case than the other of you.
I'm sure, as he said in his confirmation here, he hasn't thought about any of these issues. He's going in fresh. Anybody's guess.
I'm also sure that he's probably reading furiously right now and preparing.
But I will completely agree with the answer that Justice Scalia's vote in this case would be similar to his vote in Locke.
Yeah.
So we're on the same page.
And worded
on
very
that.
much similarly.
Yes.
Right, well, I feel like on that note of agreement, we should end. So the case is submitted. Please join me in thanking our excellent advocates.
Thank you all for participating, especially for the Alliance Defending Freedom, for the ACLU, for SCOTUS Blog, Bloomberg, BNA, and USA Today. It's been an honor and privilege to spend time with you. Watch the news. It's going to be a historic day. I wish you a peaceful one. Take care. Thank you.